One of the most pressing questions that people have when they consult with me about getting a green card through marriage to a US citizen is about the green card interview. That's typically at the end of the process. And one of the questions that people ask is whether or not the two spouses will be separated during the green card interview. And that's what this video is about. We're going to be discussing what to expect at the green card interview and whether or not you should expect to actually be separated. If you're new to my channel, I'm Puyan Darian. I'm an immigration lawyer here to talk to you about a new immigration topic every week. A lot of people have anxiety about the green card interview, and it's no surprise that oftentimes it's the immigrant spouse who's freaking out and the US citizen spouse is like, yeah, whatever, it'll be fine, because for whatever reason. I mean, maybe the immigrant spouse has done way more research or was just on like visajourney.com hearing everyone's nightmare scenarios, whereas the US citizen is just like, well, we're in a real marriage, so what could possibly go wrong? The reality is probably a combination of the two. I will say that in all the years I've been handling green cards based on marriage, I've only seen a handful of times where the interview went very poorly and it actually resulted in the spouses eventually being separated and interrogated. That's a very unlikely outcome. For people who have a lot of evidence, they submit the evidence initially with their green card application and they bring updated evidence with them to the green card interview, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be separated. So the way the green card interview is typically structured is that both spouses will be together during the first green card interview. And it's usually just like a 15 to 40 minute conversation with an immigration officer. Sometimes the immigration officer will say to one spouse, like, I don't want you to look at your spouse when I ask you questions, just like answer me directly. And then they'll ask the other spouse questions. And these questions can range from anything. And I hesitate to give you examples because you're gonna dwell on these, but some common examples are like, what did you do for your spouse's birthday? When was your spouse's birthday? What did you guys do? What are the names of your spouse's family members? Things like that, making sure you guys are in a real relationship. Another question that recently came up was, why did your spouse get divorced from their prior spouse? This is actually something I've seen come up many times where they want to see that you guys have talked about why your prior relationships have ended. I guess USCIS officers think that this is something that a normal marriage would include, having conversations about why you got divorced from your previous spouse. But typically, the interview is not that hostile. It's usually, pretty friendly. From what I've seen, it depends. I'm sure you've heard nightmare scenarios. Remember, these USCIS officers typically have to go through like 7 to 9 of these interviews a day. And sometimes they're dealing with people who bring no evidence, and then the officer really has to dig deep and ask you a lot of really probing questions to determine whether they think it's a real marriage. So make the immigration officer's job as easy as possible, bring as much evidence as possible, familiarize yourself with that evidence so you can answer the questions as honestly and to the best of your ability as possible. And if possible, speak with an immigration lawyer before you go to the interview to prepare. This is something that I offer as a service. We do consultations where we will go through all of the evidence that the clients should bring with them to the interview, and then we'll do some practice questions, where the main value I think people get is learning how to answer questions that they don't really know the answer to. Like an immigration officer asks you a specific question and you really don't know the answer, even though you're in a real marriage, what do you say? So those are some of the things we practice when we do these practice consultations for your interviews. Let's say the immigration officer is not convinced that you're in a real marriage. Well, what they will then do is they will eventually end the interview and they will transfer your case to the fraud unit to eventually schedule what's known as a Stokes interview. It is common for the Stokes interview to be a year after your initial interview. So the interview happens, they tell you that you're gonna get a decision by mail, and months pass, nothing happens. A year passes, sometimes a year and a half passes, and eventually you get a Stokes interview notice for a second interview. At this point, if you haven't worked with a lawyer, you really should, because things are gonna get really serious when you go to a Stokes interview. When you attend a Stokes interview, the immigration officer will interview the spouses one at a time, and they won't let you speak in between interviews to pass information to each other. So the officer will interview spouse A, ask him or her up to hundreds of questions, and then the officer will repeat those exact questions to the second spouse and look for any major inconsistencies, and they'll confront you about inconsistencies during the interview, and they'll record everything you say. And if there are major inconsistencies, they will use your own words to write a decision denying your green card application. And in a worst case scenario, there will also be a fraud determination, which will affect your ability to get a green card in the future without applying for a fraud waiver. So the main takeaway from this video is prepare for your green card interview, and more likely than not, you and your spouse will not be separated.
Is the Stoke interview takes place right after the regular interview that they have?
It's like a year later.
Oh, okay. Huh. That's the thing.
Hoping that your marriage naturally just falls apart during that year.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a backlog. That's like the real reason. But,
Okay. Yeah,
but any cracks in the marriage, if it's fake, they will appear within, because they're like, you know, you paid someone $5,000 to get in this fake marriage, and they're like, all right, this is taking way longer than I thought.
yeah.
It creates problems. If you've attended a green card interview and it went super smoothly, or it resulted in a super hostile situation where you were separated, or somewhere in between where you weren't separated but it became hostile, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments below, and I know people in this channel would get a lot of value out of hearing that. If you have an interview coming up, or, you know, unfortunately a Stokes interview coming up, at this point you should really consult with a lawyer. If you want to discuss preparation for your interview with me, feel free to schedule a consultation. You can do it by calling my office or booking it directly through my website. And if you're new to my channel, be sure to like and subscribe. I put out new content every week, and I'll see you guys next week for another video.